I recently completed some continuing education where the discussion of indirect and offset functions came up due to the dangerousness inherent in these functions. So I thought it would be helpful to cover some best practices for using both of these functions. There are no Excel functions more difficult or challenging to audit and understand than the indirect and offset functions when written by another user. Since they have no effective limitations, either of these functions can point to any cell or group of cells on a worksheet. The indirect function can even point to cells on different worksheets or in different workbooks altogether without being clear. On top of the auditing challenge, both of these functions contribute significant levels of calculation overhead whenever you use them. This overhead can be mitigated through smart deployment and clever VBA use. I'll cover some rules to follow for their deployment, however the VBA approach is far outside the scope of this course. Let's start by thinking about our offset function and its inputs. It takes a cell and some numbers and can link to any cell within the same worksheet as the original cell input. Any cell A1 through XFD 1 million something could be the result of the formula. Of course, the offset function is generally written to target specific groupings of cells. Using our baseball example as a reference, our offset functions were designed to reference any grouping of cells between E5 and F26. Our dynamic named ranges work the same way. So what's something that we can do to make auditing these functions easier? Well, one thing we can do is we can provide some simple and standardized commentary, either as a comment within a cell or as a comment within the name. In this case, I'm simply going to add a comment to our linest function cells that describes the offset function we're using. The first piece of information I want to provide is the limitation imposed upon my offset result. That is, I've limited it to always be applying to a set of cells between E5 and F26. And I also want to specify that it's subject to the user inputs in cells C3 and C4. Since this offset is driven by user inputs, identifying both its range and its touch points makes testing the function and evaluating the results easier for anyone trying to learn about what your function is doing. Working backwards from the commentary we've provided, we can devise some rules to help us better design offset functions in the future and learn when to actually use them. First, we'll always want to identify the total possible range of cells that we want to look at. If the range is open-ended, as in it can go on forever and ever, then you probably want to redesign the problem from the ground up anyways. That doesn't mean that a range couldn't expand. Consider this baseball problem. I've only included 22 years. There are players with longer careers, so I might want to expand my range all the way to, say, F40 to allow up to 35 years. But even so, I'm setting some type of upper limit on my offset's range. Once the maximum range of possibilities has been determined, the next step is to determine whether you even need the offset function by asking yourself, do I need the value from a single cell, or do I need one or more cell references to input into another function? If you need only the value from a cell, you don't need an offset function at all, and you should use an index function. If you need one or more cell references, you might want an offset, but you should first consider other options. Are you performing some type of sum, max, min, average, or count on your subset of cells? If so, one of the ifs functions would be a better solution. There are a whole host of conditional summarization functions that can be used to provide solid customizable analysis of data without using an offset approach, and you should always try to use them first instead if possible. Finally, if there's not a conditional summarization function for your problem, such as a conditional standard deviation, or your function is like the linest function and requires a very specific array or range input, then you will have to rely on the offset function itself. So this is a case where I absolutely had to use an offset function to get the functionality that I desired. Now, once you've decided that you absolutely must have an offset function for a situation, how does that impact your calculation procedure, and what can you do to minimize the impact? You should identify whether any cells will depend upon the results and try to estimate how long that chain is. For example, this linest calculation has no dependencies. This is an ideal situation. As an output, it is a single recalculation, and it will have no impact on any other cells, and so there's no cascading effect. However, this is obviously not going to be the case in most cases. If you must use an offset function as an intermediate case, you should do your best to control and limit the range of impacts and document the cells that will be impacted by your offset function for both yourself and for other users. Since this function tree ends here, I'll address this in more detail with respect to the indirect function. Documenting our indirect function is just as important as for our offset function, if not more so. The indirect function can be trickier to trace as it is even more flexible. We could have an indirect function that calculates both a workbook name and a worksheet name in addition to the cell location, thereby creating a function where pinpointing the source is nearly impossible. I strongly advise against such broad usage of the indirect function for the auditing reason alone, but avoiding unintended errors with such an indirect function is nearly impossible, as file names can change easily and functionality could be impaired simply by having a different version of a file opened. But anyhow, let's look at the indirect dynamic name that we incorporated into the solution from exercise 3 for our approach. We're going to follow the same general approach for our indirect function as we did for our offset function. We're going to document the function's information, determine whether the function is necessary, and evaluate and disclose the computational impacts. As you should remember, we modified our local costs of goods name to include the indirect function directly into the name definition to improve our formula's readability. Where we've used this name in column F, I'm going to add a simple comment that says refer to local cost of goods. This keeps the comment small and unintrusive, as we have quite a bit to say. First, let's go to our name manager and look at our local cost of goods and its formula and consider what the total possible set of ranges is. Right now, we've defined our indirect as pointing to one of three possible ranges: the Y normal cost of goods, the Y foreign cost of goods, or the Y wholesale cost of goods, dependent on input D6. This follows very closely to what we wrote for our offset function. Now, do we actually need to use an indirect function here? We're identifying which range to index into, so we obviously need a reference. Is there a concrete and non-volatile way to identify that reference? That answer isn't particularly clear without some more clarification as to our problem. Is it possible that we could add more types of sales and more costs of goods? If so, the indirect function would be the best approach so as to make future unknown types simply fit into our naming conventions. If not, then we could use a switch function, which was introduced with Excel 2016, to create a non-volatile version of the dynamic name that is fixed to the currently implemented names. For now, I'm going to assume that we will need to add more types of sales in the future, so we'll say that the indirect is required. Based on that, I will add a comment to the name for the reference that says, could convert to switch if no additional type of sales necessary. Up to this point, our process has been identical to our offset function, but where our offset function had no dependencies, our indirect function feeds further down our calculation tree. We don't want to get too complicated here if we can, so I'm going to quite simply define a three-tier tree for how far out our calculations impact our workbook. We know that this name is used in cells I8 to I19, and J8 through J19 uses the I cells, and I21 uses I8 through I19. So I'll write a simple tree like this. X goes to I8 to I19, which goes to J8 to J19, and then I8 to I19 go to I21, and J18 to J19 go to J21. That's a lot of information condensed into some short little segments. I've cut myself off at just three dependencies: name to first dependency to second dependency to third dependency. But for larger workbooks with lots of interconnected links, you may want to go out as far as 4 or 5 to make sure that your tree doesn't get really wide. If we've used the name in other places, we'd want to define those trees as well, so this comment could get pretty long. If it gets long, then you have a calculation issue that you'll want to address. This documentation serves as a pressure point to help limit the impact that the indirect and offset functions have on your workbook. If you're entering 8, 10, 15, or even more lines, not only is that a hassle to document that you should want to avoid from that perspective, but it's such a level of impact that you should not want to impose it on your workbook from a calculation aspect. This concludes our quick lesson covering some of the best practices for using the indirect and offset functions. Both of these functions provide so much flexibility, but they require smart and limited implementation in order to fully be used effectively. Hopefully this lesson has given you some ideas as to how to best use these functions in a reasonable and responsible manner.